Carol, it's such a pleasure to be here talking with you about this subject we both care about quite a lot. And of course I want to ask you about the National Register and what it is and what its significance is. But before we do that, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up and how did you get interested in history?
Well, I grew up in Austin, Texas, but my mother is an only child, and she grew up in a little town called Bastrop, which is only about 20 some odd miles from Austin, and it's one of the early Texas towns, and it's a small historic town, and I spent a lot of time with my grandparents in Bastrop, and it's just full of historic buildings, and my grandmother's house was it's actually listed in the National Register now, but it's a Victorian house. And anyway, it was just a lovely atmosphere, and my grandmother and my mother both liked antiques, and we used to go looking around for antiques all the time, and I have a lot of found objects in my own home, and my kids like to find objects and antiques, so we all have kind of picked that up. So that was one thing that made me interested in history. But growing up in Austin was wonderful. It had less than 200,000 people, and we had total freedom as young people to pretty much roam the town. So I was very lucky. I had a really nice childhood, and
that is wonderful. Nice. I love the idea of you in your grandmother's Victorian house in Bastrop, Texas, where there's a Rosenwald school, right?
Well, there are two in Bastrop County that are still in existence, and Bastrop County was, I think it had about 10 freedmen's communities, because there were a lot of cotton plantations on the river, although they don't have many plantation houses or anything now, but that's an area that has quite a few African Americans, and the one school that Texas recommended for possibly being included in the park is in Bastrop County.
No, there's some sort of poetic justice there, I think. So when it came time for college, did you stay in Texas or did you go?
Well, in my time, we hardly thought there was any place better than Texas to go to college. We were very parochial. Mm-hmm. So I went to the University of Texas in Austin, mm-hmm. So for undergraduate school, and then I got a graduate degree there as well. So and my husband the same. I met him there, and mm-hmm. he got both of his undergraduate and his law degrees there.
Yeah. So when you got a graduate degree, what was it in?
In American history. Mm-hmm. So. But anyway, I've always been, I'm a big reader, and I've always been interested in travel, and I had done already quite a bit of traveling before I went to graduate school, and anyway, I'm just very curious about the world, but I just like living in history and places that have their own unique historic character and identity that tell you something about the whole heritage of communities. So anyway, I think it's because of being so much in Bastrop, Texas. And we still own my grandmother's house. Oh my gosh. I still get to live in a historic house, and it's actually really nice there because most of the historic buildings are still there.
Wow. I want to go.
Well, it's sort of a cowboy town.
Well, that's okay. I have Texas roots too, so I'm good with that. Right. So how did you get to the register? What path led you there?
Well, I met my husband at the University of Texas, and he was in law school, and I was in graduate school when we married at the very end of the time we were there. And that was in the height of the Vietnam War. And he had to go, he had been in ROTC, and he had to go on active duty. And we thought he'd go to Vietnam, but we were very lucky because when he had to go on active duty, we were sent to Würzburg, Germany. Mm-hmm. And that's another historic town and below Frankfurt where there's a World Heritage Site and whatever. And we traveled constantly when we lived in Europe for a couple of years. And then we were transferred to Seoul, Korea, and we traveled quite a bit in Southeast Asia. So ever since then, we've traveled a lot every year abroad for our entire lives. I mean, we're just really curious about the world, and we're curious about the United States. We've traveled quite a bit in the United States, and I've been able to travel quite a bit in my work. So I've been very lucky in that regard.
So the National Register of Historic Places.
Well, let me tell you how I ended up there.
Yeah.
After Joe got out of the military, and we couldn't decide where he wanted to live, but he had a clerkship, an internship here while he was in law school. And we were trying to think what would be the most exciting place we could live in the United States that was exciting as some of the cities we loved around the world that we had gone to visit during our time living abroad. And so we settled on Washington, D.C., but we didn't have any jobs. So we bought a used car, and we loaded up what we could take in the back seat of our used car, and we drove up to Washington, and we stayed on the couch of a friend of ours, still a very dear friend, and we went to knock on doors looking for jobs. And I was really lucky. I was offered several jobs, but I was offered a job in the National Park Service working at the National Register of Historic Places. And I snapped it right up, and it turned out to be just exactly right for me in terms of a career that I could appreciate and enjoy and feel like I could really make a difference. And so basically, I spent almost my entire 40 plus years at the National Park Service working at the National Register of Historic Places. I started as a historian, and I finally worked my way up to the top position as keeper of the National Register of Historic Places. So I really love the work. And the National Historic Preservation Act had been enacted into law in 1966. And it was really a result of Americans' concern about the pace of development after World War II in the United States. Urban renewal, the interstate highway system, massive dam development and water control projects in the West that were destroying archaeological sites and whatever. So people were really concerned about what was happening, and so that led to the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act. It created the National Register of Historic Places as we know it now, and it also made it possible to recognize at the national level historic places of national, state, and local significance. Before, the federal government only recognized nationally significant historic places, like units of the National Park System or National Historic Landmarks designated by the Secretary of Interior. But under the National Historic Preservation Act, it reached out to the entire country to recognize the historic places that people valued in their communities. So that was really, really important. But it also created an advisory council on historic preservation to comment on the potential effect of any kind of project in which the federal government was involved on places listed in the National Register, and eventually places eligible for and listed in the National Register. So that became very important. And
so being listed on the National Register was an insurance
that it would at least
that it would be preserved.
Well, no, not that it would be preserved, but at least it would be considered in the planning of these federal and federally assisted projects, whether urban renewal or licensing to do anything or direct grants or whatever.
Carol, give me an example of a place that was preserved thanks to the National Historic Preservation Act.
Well, it really depends on how much the people care about the historic place. So this National Register depends on the people to tell the federal government what's important to them. And so sometimes there are controversies as a result of proposed projects in which the federal government is involved. And that was one of the most significant things that we were involved in, either listing a property on the National Register, and sometimes that was controversial, or determining its eligibility for listing, which would also activate a review by the Advisory Council on Historic preservation, and just some of the kind of interesting cases that I have been involved in and been asked to make a decision. Well, we talked about the French Quarter in New Orleans, but I was not involved in that. That was before my time. But in recent years, some of the ones that I think have been particularly interesting, that is one example is Camp 4 in Yosemite National Park. Mm-hmm. The National Park Service has to evaluate whether something in a national park is eligible for the National Register, including in the great parks like Yosemite or Yellowstone or whatever, where you think of them as being natural parks. They have many, many historic and cultural resources within their boundaries. But this was really an unusual case. The Park Service was going to put new employee housing on an area in Yosemite Valley on which was located what was called Camp 4. And Camp 4 turned out to be in the place where the modern sport of rock climbing was invented between about 1947 and 1970. And so when the climbers who had been part of this, they developed all the moves and everything on those rocks and so forth in the valley. And a lot of the grips they used and other things. And anyway, so when the climbers all over the world really discovered that they were going to lose Camp 4 where they camped and did this climbing, there was a terrible uproar. And so the Park Service eventually requested a determination of eligibility. And under the way the National Register criteria is set up, generally the property has to be significant more than 50 years ago unless it's of exceptional significance. Well, when we got the request for the determination of eligibility from the Park Service, nobody in our office had ever heard of Camp 4. We didn't know what it was, but we began getting boxes of letters from all over the world of people talking about the importance of Camp 4. And anyway, eventually we determined it was exceptionally significant after we discovered that the only history of rock climbing ever written was named Camp 4, and we'd gotten boxes full of letters of support from Americans and from people around the world. So that was one interesting one. And
that's very interesting.
Probably the last one that I was involved in that was really, really a controversial decision was a request for a determination of eligibility for Nantucket Sound. This was very unusual.
Well, I bet I know why. Was that when there was the plan for the wind farm?
Yes, yeah. Right. And Nantucket Sound, I mean, there was a lot of objection from the communities around to a big warm wind farm in the middle of Nantucket Sound. But the Wampanoag Indians who lived on Martha's Vineyard and had come and settled in that area, thousands of years ago as part of the Native American settlement of the Cape Cod and the island area, it was very significant to them culturally. And at the earlier in history, the whole sound had not been underwater, and so they'd actually been in what was now covered with water, and members of their community had been buried there, and it had sacred value. It was a food source. It was important in their folk lore and in their, it was really important. So ultimately, I ended up determining that eligible for the National Register, Nantucket Sound and some of the surrounding area. And the wind farm was not built there. No. And I think there's going to be a wind farm off the coast, but I think a combination of all the objection and the heightened understanding of the value of the place, that I think the determination of eligibility reinforced, I think ultimately helped ensure better planning and that the wind farm would be put somewhere else. But anyway, so that was another,
Interesting. Yeah.
really important one. And There's also a provision in the law that the way the law is set up, nominations are made to the National Register by the states through state preservation officers in each state, by federal agencies through federal preservation officers they appoint, and American Indian tribes can also participate and nominate properties on tribal lands. So that's pretty important. But in the state of Virginia, an example of one where in the act it says that anybody can appeal the refusal of a nominating authority to nominate a property to the National Register, and that comes up to the keeper of the National Register to decide the appeal. And we had a really interesting one that has to do with African American education. The Robert Rousseau Moton High School in Farmville, Virginia, which you probably know since you know so much about African American education. But in 1951, a number of students, African American students, walked out of their apparently very inferior high school compared to the school for white children, and they were wanting to have, and they wanted to be a part of the white school, and they wanted to have a school just as good as the white young people had in Farmville. But it was still controversial at the local level, and I don't think the local community wanted to preserve the school. And so the State Review Board for Virginia, which reviews proposed nominations to the National Register, recommended it for listing, but the state didn't send it forward because of the controversy, and then it was appealed to the National Register, and so I ended up determining that it was eligible for the register. It's very important. That became one of the 5 cases that was consolidated in the case that led to the Brown v. Board decision in 1954. So now it's not only listed in the National Register, it's a National Historic Landmark, and it's also a Civil Rights Museum.
A museum, yeah.
So I mean, and that's, and I do think that listing in the National Register help people really emphasize and understand the significance of the school. And that's a nationally significant property.
Absolutely.
For the role it played.
Well, that kind of brings us to Rosenwald. When did you become aware of Rosenwald schools?
Well, that's another thing that's kind of interesting. The state preservation officers in the 15 states where there were Rosenwald schools have tried to be active to nominate the remaining schools to the National Register of Historic Places, and a number of them have actually done context studies at the state level about the Rosenwald schools in their state and identified what made them significant, and then they individually nominate properties under these context studies. And so a lot of the Rosenwald schools are listed in the National Register, and the states continue to survey and nominate more Rosenwald schools to the National Register all the time. So that really has helped, I think, reinforce people's understanding. But I personally, Americans are woefully uneducated about American history, and I learned so much just working, at the National Register about American history. But I don't think they really do not know anything about how difficult it was after slavery ended, and all the way even after the Brown v. Board decision supposedly required integration for African American children to get a quality education. So when I think I heard about the beginning of the campaign from Kate Stevenson, another person who's on the board of the campaign. I know you've interviewed her, and she's appeared in the newsletter because she was a former colleague of mine at the National Park Service, and so I was really interested in it on a number of levels. I knew from talking to Dorothy Cantor that we didn't really have any units of the National Park System that really honor the contributions of Jewish Americans to American history. And that's pretty amazing, actually. It seems to me that, and having seen that same documentary that I think that she and others have seen about Julius Rosenwald and his philanthropy, and particularly his incredible work and his grants to African American related causes, really, I thought, made it incredibly significant and very important that the National Park Service consider establishing a new unit. And as I learned more about the Rosenwald schools and the fact that a third of the African American children in the South during the period in the early 19th century had gone to these schools, and his other philanthropy toward African Americans, I thought, I can't think really of a better park of people helping other people. And this is a story that we badly need to have told right now in the United States about how we can help each other.
And it's very much of a story about community.
Right, and also how badly the local communities wanted to have quality education for their children, that these were challenge grants and that the communities were required to have their school districts support the construction of a school and for the community to be engaged and involved in contributing to, whether it was through donating land or money or even labor to help build the schools and so forth. So I am very, very confident that this unit of the park system can make an enormous contribution to our understanding as Americans of our history. So I very much hope that the National Park Service will recommend the designation of a new unit. And, you know, having Rosenwald schools as part of the unit, or several of them at least, I think is tremendously important, because that's an enormous reflection of the impact of some of the grants that Julius Rosenwald was responsible for giving.
You've visited a lot of Rosenwald schools now, I imagine.
Well, I've visited quite a few as a result of us asking the state preservation officers for advice on some of the most important schools that might be considered to be part of a unit of the park system. And I've been very impressed by the stories we've heard from individuals that attended the school and have incredibly warm feelings about the education they received and the community there in these schools. And I know in the school I visited in Bastrop County, where we have our house, the Hopewell School, the land was donated by a family that had, they had been part of the Freeman community and come from slavery, and the land was donated for the construction of the school. And the daughter of the couple who had the land that was donated became the first teacher at the school, and the family still owns the land around the school and is involved in the preservation efforts. But so that was important. And I went to visit a high school in Fort Myers, Florida, and I was flabbergasted to find that when the school was built in the 1920s, African American children didn't have access to a high school education in that county or in the two counties around the county in which the school was located. That's pretty shocking.
It is very shocking, and it's a story that you hear over and over again of people going to live with an aunt or a grandmother or someone who lived in a place where there was a high school because there was no high school that they could go to.
Right. So, I mean, this is something that all Americans need to know and understand. And I really don't think they appreciate it at all. I know I studied American history, and I've taught American history at the college level and at lower level. And honestly, people don't learn this.
Yeah.
They don't learn a lot about American history. And so I think that's one reason we have so much conflict in our country, because we don't really understand what happened in our nation over time.
And this story is a particularly good sort of window on a part of that history that
Right.
this has a lot to teach us.
But it's also a happy story in that the people that we've talked to who went to the school, have been associated with the school, are really proud of the schools and feel like they really got a good education in those schools.
Have such positive feelings
Right,
about them. Yeah.
right.
No, it's always an upbeat experience to go visit a school and to talk to the people. That's what I've found. It's a very positive, affirming experience.
Right. But you know, just going back to Julius Rosenwald, in general, the fact that he felt that he had done so well and made so much money that he wanted to give back, and that he thought about giving back to people who he felt really needed to have help, and not just with the grants to the schools, but with the Rosenwald Fellows and with the challenge grants to build YMCAs and YWCAs for African American and so forth. But I mean, he was a remarkable person on so many levels, and I hope the park will tell the whole story of his life in terms of his success as a businessman, his work during his volunteering for the government to be involved in efforts having to do with the war, and his philanthropy overall. I mean, I just really admire him. I wish I had been able to meet him in person. So anyway, I'm just really, really happy and feel very fortunate to be a part of the campaign.
So Carol, you're no longer the keeper of the National Register of Historic Places.
Right, I retired from the National Park Service at the beginning of 2015, but I've continued to be very involved in historic preservation related causes. I'm on the State Review Board for Historic Preservation for Virginia, and I'm on the Executive Committee of the Board of Preservation Action, which is our national preservation lobby. And of course, I'm on the board of the campaign to establish
Very important member
Julius
of the board of the
Rosenwald
campaign. Yeah.
National in Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park, and I've actually recently gotten involved in a campaign to establish another unit of the park system, the Chesapeake Bay National Recreation Area. And I'm I'm a former board member and a fellow of the U.S. Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, and I'm on the review committee for a little grant program that the first keeper of the National Register established called the Keepers Preservation Education Fund, which gives small grants to help further the education of students and professionals working in historic preservation. And I think that's it right now, but I'm not absolutely sure.
Sounds like a
but
lot.
I'm pretty
Sounds
involved.
Like you're busy.
Well, sometimes I feel like I've got a full-time job.
Well, they say if you're doing something you love, it's not work.
Well, I really believe that this is important to the American people, not just to know more about American history, but because preserving the character and the identity of our communities is important to our quality of life and to understanding ourselves as a nation. In fact, some of my favorite listings on the National Register are historic districts of all kinds and communities around the nation, because we're such an interesting and diverse nation, and the places we live, they reflect our heritage as Americans, and they're just as important to the people who live there, and really should be to all the rest of us too. So I'm just really glad to see that we have a National Register of Historic Places that can recognize what our people value. There's a lot more to be done too, and a lot more to be added. So there's a big push right now, and rightly so, to get more listings in the National Register that reflect everybody's history. You know, we need more culturally diverse historic places listed in the National Register, because we're not going to understand that history unless we have what everybody values recognized in our National Register.
Thank you.